friends. My name is Linda Resch, and I am an artist. Today, I'll be demonstrating how to convey depth and distance in a simple landscape scene like this one that you might find near my home in North Dakota. And at the end of our lesson, I have a special treat for you. I'm going to take you on a tour of the gallery inside the Art Center in Jamestown, North Dakota, and show you how I convey depth and distance as a professional artist in my own landscape paintings. A landscape is an outdoor scene that can sometimes include a small building, a distant city, a road, or other man-made objects, but our main focus is on nature. Plant life, the sky, and the land. As we create our drawings together, I'll show you easy ways to make your landscape look more realistic and give some tips and tricks that you can use to draw any landscape that you want. I've been working with the Art Center for the last 3 years as a teaching artist, conducting art lessons with elementary school students in Jamestown and in other communities around North Dakota through the North Dakota Council on the Arts, the NESC and Connect Ed, and several other organizations. When I was in elementary school, I already knew that I wanted to be an artist. So I went to college and majored in art. My professors taught me a lot of techniques that helped me become a better artist, but when I graduated college, I still wasn't sure what job I wanted to do. I illustrated a children's book for one of my friends, then I went to work for a school photography company. Photography is an art job, right? But I wasn't very happy working for a large corporation, so I decided to try selling my own artwork and making a living through art alone. In 2014, I began selling paintings at art fairs and street festivals around North and South Dakota in the summer months. And in 2017, I joined the North Dakota Council on the Arts artist roster and began my first teaching residency here at the Art Center in Jamestown. I was asked to return in 2018 and again in 2019 and 2020. This is meant to be a temporary position, and I actually like that about teaching residencies. I'm not a school teacher. I go around to several schools in the same year, sometimes for a week, sometimes for a few months at a time, sometimes online through Zoom, and sometimes I go right into the classroom. This year, I also began teaching drawing and painting at the University of Jamestown. This summer, I painted 3 murals, and I've illustrated 2 additional books since I've been here. Last year, I started a YouTube channel where I share art lessons and tutorials, travel sketching videos, and other art projects that I'm working on. It took a lot of practice, patience, and perseverance, but eventually my hard work paid off, and I am a professional artist now. I'm not famous by any means, but my art has become fairly well known around Jamestown and around North and South Dakota in general. We'll take a look at some of my artwork at the end of our lesson. Showing depth and distance is important in my artwork because it helps my paintings to look more realistic and more three-dimensional. But having an understanding of how to show depth and distance is important in other careers too. Map makers, architects, city planners, landscape designers, illustrators, and set designers all need to have a strong understanding of depth and distance to do their jobs. What other careers can you think of that might need a strong understanding of depth and distance? This is a basic landscape scene showing apple trees in the summer or fall, lining a country road. It's drawn on vertically oriented paper, meaning the tall way, and this helps to give height to our scene. Nearly every landscape features a horizon line. The horizon line separates the ground from the sky, and it tells us where we can place our objects in our scene. A common mistake that beginning artists make is assuming that only the bottom of the paper is ground and the top is the sky. This means that every object gets drawn on one even plane, and we tend to forget about objects in the distance or anything beyond the subject of our drawing. The land is typically divided further to show foreground, middle ground, distant ground, and horizon line. We use less and less detail and more simple colors to give the illusion that we are moving farther away as we get towards the center of our drawing. We see that our tallest tree, the one growing off the top of the page, has significantly more detail than the other trees. The grass growing at the bottom of our page is also quite detailed, but once we travel over our first hill, we see a lot less detail, and as we approach our horizon line, we can't see any detail at all. Our country road also gets smaller and smaller as we travel towards the horizon line. To get started today, you will need a pencil with an eraser and a sheet of white construction or typing paper. I'll be demonstrating on 9x12 paper today, but any size will work. Avoid using notebook paper with lines if you can. Optional supplies include a larger eraser, a fine-tipped black marker for tracing over your finished scene, and coloring supplies like crayons, markers, and colored pencils. You can pause the video here if you need to go grab supplies. So double check to make sure that your paper is turned vertically, the tall way. And we're going to start by very lightly sketching out our hills and our horizon line. I'm going to start about 2 inches off the bottom of my page and draw a gently curving line that goes from the left side of my paper to the right. This line should resemble more of an S curve than M-shaped hills. These might work great for cartoon, but we are trying to draw more realistic today, so please don't draw your hills like this. Try to create a more gentle, simple, sloping curve. Next, we want to draw the middle ground hills above our foreground. So I'm going to go another 2 inches up or so and come across with another gently curving line, but we want to make sure that we are not making a line that is exactly the same shape as our first one. We want to have a little bit of variety in these hills. Lastly, I'm going to draw my distant hills and the line that will become my horizon line. So once again, I'm just going to make a gentle curve going across my page. Now I have my foreground, my middle ground, my distant ground, and my horizon line. Now that we've established what is ground and what is sky, we can begin drawing trees, shrubbery, rocks, and grass. Whatever you would see in your scene that grows up from the ground or sits on top of the land. The main focus of our landscape are the trees and the country road. We are going to start by drawing our road going up and over the hills, and then we will add trees along our roadside afterward. There are 2 important things to note when trying to show roads disappearing off into the distance. Number 1, the road is widest at the bottom of the page. The road is going to continue to get progressively more narrow as it moves towards that horizon line. In fact, the road nearly comes to a point as it gets to the horizon line. This is known as the vanishing point, and it is the point where a road vanishes or disappears over the hills and into the distance. As our road crosses over the hills and into a more distant strip of land, we need to imagine how this looks in the real world. The road is going to go up and over a hill, but then it disappears into a valley, and we can't see it in our drawing. Whenever and wherever the road reappears on our paper again, it has to be drawn noticeably smaller than the last time we saw it. This can be confusing to beginners, so I like to think of it as the road being shaped like a tiered birthday or wedding cake, or like stairs. So to begin drawing my road, I'm going to make a small dot on my horizon line. This is my vanishing point. Usually I put it in the center of the page, but it could be anywhere along the horizon line. So I'm going to start at my vanishing point and draw a line that diagonals slightly towards the left of my paper. I'm going to stop when I reach my first hill. Remember, the road disappears at this point and we don't see it for a while. Then I'm going to draw another line that angles downward, slightly towards the right of my paper. My road should look like a skinny triangle at this point. Now remember, the road has disappeared, and next time we see it again, we need to think of it as a tiered cake or stairs. We need to space our road out, the same distance on either side, but making it noticeably bigger when we see it come over the hill again. So I'm going to space my road out and draw another set of angled lines coming down to the next hill. Then my road disappears again. When I see it, we need to space out and continue drawing this road down to the bottom of our page. A curved road works much in the same way as the straight road. If you want to draw a curved road, you're going to start at the vanishing point and draw a road that arcs just slightly to the left. Then you'll go back to the vanishing point again and follow that arc down, but making sure to aim more towards the right of your paper this time so that you widen that angle. It should resemble a shark fin as it disappears behind the first hill. When my road reappears, it spaces outward. It could be coming out over here, closer to the right side of your page. Remember to make it noticeably bigger when it reappears. Disappears behind the last hill, our foreground. And then when we see it again, it has to be drawn much larger. When your road hits the bottom of the paper, your first reaction might be that it seems too big. However, most of the time, students seem to make the road too small, and they're far away objects much too large. As you're finishing up your road, double check to make sure that your road is narrowest at the vanishing point and spaces outward every time it reappears over a hill. Now we are ready to make trees. There are a few things to remember when drawing trees or other objects that grow up from or sit on top of the ground. Arguably, the most important thing to remember is that we never ever want to place the bottom of our tree directly on the bottom of our page. The bottom of our paper is not the ground line. Our trees can grow from anywhere inside of our hills, but we want to avoid drawing the trunk all the way to the bottom of the page. Instead, leave at least a ½ inch of ground showing underneath the base of your trunk or whatever object you might be drawing. This lets your audience know that there is indeed dirt underneath that tree. If the trunk goes all the way to the bottom edge of the page, our brain gets confused and doesn't know if the tree awkwardly grows from right there or if it continues down lower, cropped from our view, and if so, how far down does it go? As with every rule, you'll find a few exceptions. Our road goes to the bottom edge of the paper, but I think most of us readily understand when we see it that the road might continue on and on for miles. When we begin adding finer details like blades of grass, they might touch up against the bottom edge of the page too, but they will be scattered evenly throughout our foreground, and the few that touch the bottom edge merely complete our pattern. The top of our tree, however, can and should run off the edges of our paper, at least in our nearest and tallest tree. This again adds to the illusion that this tree is very tall and very close to us. It's so close that we had to crop part of it out of our frame, as we might do when we're taking a photograph. It's going to help your drawing seem more realistic if you try to extend some objects in your scene off the side and the top edges. It looks far more natural to see branches and leaves cropped and extending beyond the page than it would to try to force your tree to fit within the space, resulting in unnatural edges on branches and leaves. So we'll start by placing our pencil somewhere in the foreground, at least a ½ inch from the bottom of the paper and far enough away from your road that there is a nice sized gap between the trunk and the road, making sure that the trunk is not touching or overlapping the road. I'll draw the left side of my tree trunk starting with a tiny hook curve and then continue pretty much straight up through all of my ground lines until I'm tall into the sky. I want to make sure that I go above my horizon line. For the right side of my tree trunk, I'll do the same thing again and continue my trunk up tall. If you draw your tree trunk skinny, like I just did, it will tend to make your tree look taller and skinnier. If your trunk is a little bit wider, it will just make your tree look a little bit thicker. Either way is fine. Once you get up into your sky, above your horizon line, we want to branch our tree out into a Y shape. Now the trunk should be the widest branch. So the trunk is going to be widest at the bottom, stays about the same size, maybe gets a little narrower. When it branches off, these two Y-shaped branches should be about half the size of the trunk. And if you're going to add any additional branches, they will continue to get smaller as they come out of this Y shape. I'm going to cover my branches with leaves today, so I don't need to do very many additional branches. But if you were drawing a winter scene, you would want to make sure that your tree has several branches, maybe even extending off the top and side edges of your page. So once I have my main tree drawn, I'm going to start drawing my bushy leaves around it. I want to make sure that there's a gap between my leaves and my ground, so I'm going to see some sky showing underneath my leaves. So I'll start somewhere near the top of my tree, but not exactly the top. Leaves are going to come down and bush very fluffy around your main tree trunk. So I'm going to start drawing just a zigzaggy, bushy line that kind of forms the shape of a circle, but we don't want a perfect circle. When I get to the top edge of my paper, I'm going to just imaginary draw with my pencil around my tree until I would naturally return onto the page. You can also go in front of your tree trunk if you'd like. Now, if you're going to color this picture later, you can wait to add other details until you're using your coloring supplies. If you're drawing just in pencil today, you may want to go ahead and draw a few other clusters of leaves in the inside of your tree. Now that you have your closest tree drawn, we can go into our middle ground and add our second tree. This one is also going to go tall up into the sky, but maybe not quite as tall as our first one. And my Y-shaped branches this time don't want to go up as tall on our page either. For this tree, I want my leaves to stay beneath the top edge of the paper. So not going off the top of the page, but it's okay if they still go off of the side. Now this tree has some sky showing above it, so it makes it look smaller than the first tree that we drew. And it also makes it look farther away. This tree would not have as much detail, but maybe just a few clusters of leaves would be visible. After we've finished our middle ground tree, we can go ahead and add some trees on the horizon line or in the distant ground. Trees on the horizon line are going to be very small and not include very much detail at all. Trees coming up somewhere else in the distant ground might be just a little bit taller, but they're still very far away and look very small, and we wouldn't really see much detail. It's going to help your scene look more realistic if you include some overlapping, as I have done. My tallest tree is cutting right in front of this tree in the distance, and that helps it to look like this tree is very close, this tree is very far away. You can continue adding trees in your scene. If you want it to look like a heavily forested area, you'll want to add a lot more trees along the horizon line and in your distant ground. If you want it to look like more of a meadow with sparse trees, you wouldn't have to add very many more. You could also go ahead and add a sunset or some clouds up in your sky if you wanted to. Be careful that you don't fill up your page very much, or it will start to look too busy and have too much going on. So the next thing I want you to do is to erase the lines that are cutting through your tree. You want to erase these ground lines because the tree is in front of these ground lines, so we want to make sure that we don't see them. Then we can go ahead and add some detail to our nearest objects in the foreground and a little bit of detail in the middle ground. I like to add some bark lines in my tree. If you're going to color this project, you might wait to do this and do it with crayon, marker, or colored pencil. My tree in my middle ground, again, is not going to show as much detail in the bark, and it's not going to have as much detail in the leaves either. My tree in the foreground, however, might actually see some apples hanging from it. Maybe an apple even fell down onto the ground. I like to make a ring of grass that curves around the base of the tree, kind of forming the shape of a spoon, very gentle curve. And then I'm going to add some individual blades of grass along the foreground. This is where we actually may see blades of grass coming down to the bottom of the page, but it's going to be spaced evenly throughout the foreground. We wouldn't see as much detail in the middle ground, so I'm not going to add individual blades of grass there, but I might add some clusters of grass growing around this tree to help make it seem more grounded. And maybe a few patches of grass here and there. Again, if you're going to color this scene, you don't need to do this detail work in pencil. You can do that in crayon, marker, or colored pencil. Back here, we wouldn't see any detail at all, but I still like to put just a little line of grass underneath this tree to let us know that it's on the ground. So last thing would be my road. And to make it look like a gravel road, I like to use a texturing technique called cross-hatching. It involves drawing lines that are going to mimic the shape of the road. So first I'm making diagonal lines. I don't want to go up into my middle ground layer. Remember, this road is something separate from this one. So I want to try to draw and color them separately and think of them as separate sections of road. I also like to draw maybe a few circle shapes that look like rocks, gravel. If you're drawing a city street, you might think about putting lines down the center of your road. So then my cross-hatching technique, I need to draw some horizontal lines that crisscross through those vertical diagonal lines that I drew. I think this helps the road look like it has tire tracks or just a little bit more texture than maybe just coloring it brown. When I get over the hill, I'm going to see a little bit of texture again, but not very much this time. And I won't really see any texture at all once I get into my background road. You can add a sunset, a moon, or clouds in your sky, depending on the time of day that you're making. You might also add a slightly larger rock or hole or flowers down in your foreground, where we would see that level of detail. Since this is a landscape scene, our focus is on the land. We wouldn't want to fill up our scene with animals, people, or objects that people made. However, I often encourage my students to draw a hint of an animal, like deer tracks, bear claw marks on the tree, or a bird's nest. Again, these are things that would only be visible in the foreground. This way, if you color over your pencil lines, you'll still be able to see them. You might also consider using a combination of markers, colored pencil, and crayon together to achieve a wider range of color blends and textures. For an in-depth tutorial on combining these three most common art supplies, you can go to my YouTube channel, Sketching Spot, and watch the video titled Easy Advanced Coloring Techniques. I hope you've enjoyed creating your landscape drawing today. Remember, the things that we covered today can help you when drawing any landscape, any place, any season, any time of day. Now, I would like to show you how I use what we learned today to create some landscape paintings of my own. Now let's take a look at some of my landscape paintings that are on display at the Art Center Gallery in Jamestown, North Dakota. Even though the subject of this piece is the horse, I've included elements of depth and distance in the background to help make the subject stand out. In this painting, we see several layers of foreground, middle ground, distant ground, and our horizon line. About a third of this painting is sky, and 2/3 of the painting ground. Using depth and distance in a background can help to add emphasis on your subject matter. In this little landscape painting, 2/3 of our canvas is sky, which forces us to draw our attention to the large cloud formation that is rolling over the prairie. We also see elements of depth and distance in the land. We have foreground with a tiny hay bale and some telephone poles rising up halfway into the sky, which again puts an emphasis on the cloud formation. And then we see several layers of middle ground, distant ground, and our horizon line. In this painting titled Kelly's Collie, the focus is on the collie, but we see how including atmospheric perspective, showing depth and distance, really adds a lot to this composition. We are pulled down into the land. We see the collie standing in tall grass, and we know that this is our foreground. This is the grass that is closest to us because we can see individual blades, very tall and very thick. The grass also changes in color and tone as we move from foreground to middle ground and very distant background along our horizon line. These two spray paint landscapes illustrate how we can also show depth and distance in a water scene. We can see that the waves and the ripples in the water appear larger in the foreground and get smaller and less defined as we move back into the distance. We see this rock formation right along our horizon line and some larger boulders in our middle and foreground. We also see this rock formation starting out slightly larger and angling back smaller as we move towards the horizon line. The moon is very large and would be seen as being close to us, and we see the reflection of the moon in the foreground water. In this particular piece, we see much of the same. We see defined splashes along our rocks. We see large rippled waves and more definition in color in our foreground. And as we move into the middle ground, we see less definition in those waves and more solid color planes that are not defined with detail. These two cityscape paintings show a different type of depth and distance by using a technique called one-point perspective. In this technique, all of the objects in our foreground angle back towards a point on our horizon line. In this scene, we don't really see the point because our street fades off into the darkness. The horizon line will be somewhere about right here, and everything that we see is meeting up at that point on the horizon line. In this particular piece, our street and our sidewalk is angling back over a hill. In this piece, this would be our horizon line. We notice that the buildings get smaller as they angle back towards that horizon line and vanishing point. We see it on both sides of the street, how the buildings appear large on the sides of the canvas and get progressively smaller as they get towards the center. One-point perspective is a great tool to use when you are trying to show depth and distance.
Now I'd like to take you on a quick tour of the gallery inside the Art Center in Jamestown. We'll just do a quick pan around the gallery so you can see the space and the pieces that are hanging. My show will be on display until January 23rd, 2021, and after that, a new artist will have their work on display here. If you go to an art gallery, it's very important that you don't touch the artwork, as artwork is fragile and we don't want to leave fingerprints behind on a painting. The paintings that I have on display were painted with acrylic or watercolor, and I also experimented with some spray paint pieces this summer. All of the artwork that you see here was inspired by my time in Jamestown, the experiences I've had here, and the sights that I've seen while I've lived in this little city.
Thank you so much for joining me on this tour of the Art Center Gallery. A special thanks to the North Dakota Council on the Arts, the NESC, and Connect Ed for sponsoring this video. Stay tuned for more art lessons from the NESC and NDCA coming very soon. If you would like to check out more of my art tutorials, you can visit my website, sketchingspot.com, or you can go to my YouTube channel, Sketching Spot. See you next time. Cheers!